So I can, I'm actually in the office at the moment at Euston. I can hear the church bells ringing, which means that it's 11 o'clock. So I think we better get going to be respectful and mindful of your time. Um, just a few, I think most people know the sort of the webinar etiquette, but just to run through a couple of things just so that you know about them. If at any time you've got any questions or comments or feedback for us, do just activate the chat window at the bottom and type in there. That'd be great to know. What we're going to try and do with questions is there are certain sort of natural pauses in the presentation, in the briefing, and at those points we may be able to clarify things that have been unclear or answer your questions if they're relatively quick. We're going to try and run at about 45 minutes, and we've allowed a certain amount of time at the end for people to ask individual questions. So that might be a time where we'll defer a question if you put it in the chat, and we'll actually pick it up at the end. And also because some people's questions may be a little bit more complex or require a slightly fuller answer, there will be an option, if you would like to take it up, of having a chat on the telephone with us at a later time and date, which we can organize to give you a much kind of fuller answer to any question that you may have. So hopefully that will be useful for you. Okay, so let's move on and just have a talk about what kind of briefing this is. This is our inaugural webinar, and it is about, we've called them bite-sized briefings. And the reason we've called that is that they're meant to be sort of clear and concise, bite-sized, easily digestible pieces of information, and they're to help you in a couple of ways. The first way is to make better informed IT decisions, and the second way is to actually make better practical use of IT day to day. And so there'll be two types of briefings. One is actually a sort of hands-on session. So what might that look like? Let's say, for example, that you were wanting to run a project and you were wanting, I don't know, to create a new website or something like that. You wanted to collaborate with external people like developers and designers and people like that, but you had an internal team as well, and you wanted to create channels for those teams. So some were going to work on web dev, some were going to work on branding, some were going to work on messaging or whatever it is. You can set all that up in teams and set the right permissions for the external people and the right permissions for the internal people and all that kind of thing. So that would be actually a hands-on, how do you do this? How do you work with it? That's not the nature of our session this morning. This briefing is the other kind of briefing. Now that briefing is intended for strategic and planning purposes, and it's for those people who have responsibility for making decisions about IT, so that IT is actually helping fulfill business goals, is helping your organization fulfill its potential. And those people need to make well-informed decisions, and they need to do things like make sure they've got the right priorities set, make sure that they're doing return on investment correctly, and make sure that they can give answers to the board about how and why they've chosen a particular path with IT. So this session is actually a strategic session. So that brings us to the topic of this particular session. And I'd like to introduce you to, actually this guy is really rather extraordinary, and he does a pretty extraordinary thing as well. So the person that you can see on the slide at the moment is called Darren Taylor, and he's also known as Professor Splash for reasons that will become apparent very soon. So he is standing on a platform which is just over 11.5 meters high. He is a world record holder at diving from height into shallow water. So when he jumps off that platform, he's going to have to get his leap right so that he is exactly over that rather small looking paddling pool that is below him, which is about the size of a family car. He's going to reach a speed of over 50 kilometers per hour. And then he's going to have to effect a safe landing in what is only 30 centimeters of water. So it's a quite extraordinary thing that he does, and you probably see now why he's called Professor Splash. However, the question is, what has all that got to do with Microsoft Teams and Zoom? Well, on March the 23rd, in the UK, we went into lockdown. And that was a rather anxious time for many of us, because in effect, what we were having to do was we were going to have to dive off into some rather extraordinary circumstances. And we were going to have to use IT and video conferencing to keep in touch with people in ways that may have been unfamiliar to us. And regardless of our state of preparation for this, we had to just dive off and get it done. Now, of course, There are considerable risks in that. And one of the risks is that you could have a pretty dreadful crash landing. But our best hope was that actually we were all going to pull together. We were going to get our head around new tools and new ways of working. And actually, we were going to make the best use of those. And we get to a point where actually we could sit back and we could pat ourselves on the back for a job very well done, rather the equivalent of Darren's world records. Now, Darren prepares very carefully and he makes incremental changes. And I think he's done something like 20 iterations of his world record. He's broken it 20 times. And little by little, he inches his way up that platform. So that's my kind of analogy for the situation that we were in and how we can make best use of Microsoft Teams and Zoom. Raja, my colleague, his natural habitat is sort of analysis and strategy. And so he's going to translate for you what that risk and reward environment and how it translates into use of Microsoft Teams and Zoom. So over to you, Raja.
Thanks, Simon. Simon is quite right. We had no option but to dive in, and it's now been about 3.5 months. My view is that it's now time to step back and take stock of where we are, and let's try and work out what our future is. So I'm going to try and sketch out what the future can look like. So that's a straightforward timeline. On the left-hand side, you've got now, and over to the right, we have future. On the y-axis, I'm going to call it success, but you can translate that to profitability, you can translate that to productivity, you can translate that to risk and resilience, etc. But it's basically how well is my organization doing? To kind of put some context of time frame on it, let's think about it as two ways, which is from now to the end of the year, so give or take 6 months, and into 2021 and 2022. Simon is right. I think we all do deserve a pat on the back because every organization had to swivel and get productive very, very quickly, irrespective of where they were. And on the whole, I think we did well. So I doubt there is very much difference in the organization. So if you think of the amber dot, those are, let's say, average people. And the red dot is people who didn't do quite so well. And the green dot are people who did better. So let's have a look at the amber dot and where it's going to go. I think of that amber line as muddling along. In a way, it's haphazard. There'll be some minor wins and some minor losses. And it's really a continuation of the last 3.5 months. And the last 3.5 months was do whatever you need to do. But there's a problem here. That 3.5 months ago when we went into lockdown, we had to just dive in and get on with it. But now it's time to step back. And if you just take this attitude of just do whatever you need to do, I think it's going to lead to lackluster results. The red dots are companies that have, I'm going to call it bad luck, some form of bad luck. And you could think about that as, let's say they lose a key client, or they have a security breach, or they have a DSAR, a digital subject access request, or an employee leaves, a senior employee leaves and sets up in business as a competitor. It doesn't really matter what the event is. We can think about it as bad luck. But the net result is that there is a loss of profitability, productivity, or as I've labeled it here, success. The green line are companies that embrace a new path, because it is undoubtedly true that the world has changed because of COVID-19. And this group, they really think about it, they thrive, and they have a deliberate plan that is executed and reviewed and adapted in an evolutionary methodology. I'm going to give you a simple example here of how I see those 3 lines and 3 futures. Let's take something like onboarding. So if you're onboarding new members of staff and you're on that amber line, you know, it's probably harder than it should be. It's less productive than it should be when you were normally pre-COVID in the office. It kind of goes okay, and that's what it is. It's neither here nor there. The red line is it doesn't go very well at all, and potentially that organization loses a good employee, and it's been an expensive process. All that time that went into recruiting, the agency fees, the onboarding time, the management time, etc. And that potential good employee says, you know what, this company is not for me, I'm going. The green line is an onboarding process that has worked really, really well. And that new employee turns out to be a very well integrated member of staff, and they go on to become a star. And you can see how those three scenarios play out very differently. So that kind of gives you an idea. So how does this apply to Zoom and Teams, and why are we saying it's Zoom and Teams? Let's have a look at the last 3 months. Certainly for me, in the last 3 months, I have used a multitude of video conferencing tools, and I'm sure you have. You might recognize some of those logos. Obviously, Zoom is up there, Microsoft Teams is there, Cisco WebEx is there, Google Meet, WhatsApp video, Apple's FaceTime, Facebook's Portal device. That's a very neat device if you've not seen it. Ring Central, Blue Jeans, and all of those I have used in a work context. There's even been things like House Party with my 12-year-old daughter and learning how to use that. Now, let's say you look at that and go, oh yeah, and you decide we will only use Zoom, we will only use Microsoft Teams. That may not be sustainable, even though we are saying you have to standardize, because the reality is that your key client may say, well, we use Cisco WebEx. Despite that, you have to adopt a strategy of standardization. And I'm going to look at why we are saying standardize on Zoom and Teams. The cost of supporting multiple software becomes prohibitively expensive, not just in cost terms, but also in productivity terms. So let's have a look at why we picked Zoom and Teams and the features between them. First thing about Zoom, it is becoming very ubiquitous in the same way as Google has become ubiquitous. And we all say, you know, did you Google that? Irrespective of what search engine you used. Or you might say, have you done the Hoovering? And it's not a Hoover. That's what's happening with Zoom. To put this into statistics, Zoom was having about 10 million people per day prior to COVID-19. They're currently running at over 200 million attendees per day. That's quite a number. So it is becoming ubiquitous. Undoubtedly, Zoom is easy to use. It doesn't require a special app. You can run it straight out of a web browser if you're using something like Chrome. And you know that it's easy to use because it's being used in a home context, and you can get your grandma to use it. The video quality on Zoom, what I found in the last 3 months is significantly better. Obviously, any video quality is dependent on your internet connection. But I think this illustrates Zoom's heritage of coming from a video conferencing background. I was asking this earlier. Zoom started on the 21st of April, 2011, and it was a breakaway team from Cisco, actually. And it originally started, the name was SASB, which I know is weird, and it failed to attract any investment. The reason it failed to attract that investment was that they thought that the video market was already saturated. Well, we all know where that went. They went public in April 2019, and if you've seen the stock price for Zoom recently, you know how people are viewing that. Again, their heritage in video conferencing shows because Zoom already allows 49 participants on screen. And Microsoft Teams currently went from 4 to 9, and they have also announced that they will go to 49. They're introducing it in education first, but they are committed on that path. And I think that, again, illustrates a point. It doesn't matter which platform you're on, it's going to be developed at quite a pace. again, as a result of COVID-19. Zoom is very easy to set up meetings. You can do it on multiple platforms, and it's easy to join meetings. You can run it without any kind of app at all, and you don't even need to log in. You can have multiple devices, so whether it's a tablet or your iPhone or your PC or Mac, it works everywhere. So again, that's another big plus point in favor of Zoom. I'm quite sure that you've all heard about Zoom security. And my observation here is that it was really geared at ease of use, and Zoom prioritized ease of use over security. So, sending the meeting ID with the password, allowing people to share their desktop without any permission from the host. However, the CEO of Zoom recognized those failings, and in the last couple of months, they have made some real strides. And version 5 now, I think it's now flipped. The security angle is being prioritized over the ease of use angle. And that process, again, is going to continue. For those of you who are interested, the Department of Defense says that you should not use Zoom for anything that has a classification of restricted or above. However, it is still used in the UK Cabinet. Zoom webinars, again, ease of use, ease of joining. It's a lot easier. Co-hosting, like Simon and I are doing at the moment. And you can have from 100 to 10,000 participants with that ease of use. It's not really a very complex process. So you can see all the plus points in Zoom's favor. So what about Teams? First thing is that Teams is included in most of Microsoft's Office 365 plans. And they've also announced that it's going to be free for at least a year, and it's very easy to go and get Teams. So you can see that all the companies are aiming for market share, and they want you to join their ecosystem. Teams is a very, very rich collaboration tool. So it's part of the Office 365 suite of programs. It has lots of extended functionality. So chat, being able to share files easily, preparing for meetings, using those files during the meetings, follow up after meetings, etc. It allows easy polls and easy feedback. It allows embedding files into chats. And the fact that it's part of the Microsoft ecosystem gives it a huge advantage. That extended functionality can be very easily extended to your clients, to your key clients, and to your key suppliers. And again, I think that's a major plus point. It's not just the Microsoft ecosystem, though. There's a concept of tabs. There are almost, think of them as extensions to Teams, and you can bring in lots and lots of other applications and data into that rich collaboration environment. So I don't know whether you know this, but it's actually possible to put a Zoom bot inside Teams, which makes that whole process of integrating Zoom and Teams much, much easier. So yes, it has a steeper learning curve than Zoom does, but you can do an awful lot more with Teams than you can with Zoom. Microsoft very much puts security at the forefront, and it is highly secure. It sits inside the Office 365 environment, and there are some very flexible arrangements. The whole issue of identity and access management and how that's controlled inside Microsoft's environment with the distributed Active Directory, if it's been set up correctly, you can ensure that only authorized people, whether they're internal to your organization or external, they only see the data that they're supposed to see, and the sensitive data is hidden away. Again, a major plus point. Because you can extend Teams to lots of other applications and lots of other data, that whole concept of curating data, and I'll talk about curating data later, is very, very important. It allows you to manage that data better. It allows you to adhere to compliance and security better. And I would argue that it's a very much a key factor in productivity. But keep the concept of curating your data in your mind, because we will come back to that. The key principle to understand is that as owners and managers of your companies, you must know where your data is and who has access to it. Here's a key point. Microsoft is not responsible for your information or your data. Actually, this is actually true for all SaaS companies, software as a service companies. And one of the biggest misconceptions that I often hear when people go into the cloud is that I hear people say, oh, I don't need to worry about backup anymore because I'm in the cloud. You know, Microsoft is backing up my data. It's not just Microsoft, as I've said, but it's really important to understand that you are responsible for your data. So Microsoft has what they call a shared responsibility model. And if you look, I don't know if you can read that on the slides, but right at the top, the responsibility that stays with the client, the customer, that's yourselves, are things like the end devices and the data and the information. And then right at the bottom, the responsibility of the cloud provider, in this case, Microsoft, they're responsible for the architecture and the back end and making sure all of that is working. So if you're thinking I'm in the cloud, I don't need to worry about backup, that is a major fallacy and requires attention. Because of that, Teams allows, it's called an API integration, but it allows third-party software to come into the Microsoft environment, read your data and suck it out of the Microsoft environment to back it up properly. And it's really important that you back up your data, and Teams allows you to do this. This concept applies irrespective of what software you're using. So for example, I don't know whether you know that when you're using Zoom meetings and someone clicks record, one of the options is that it records onto the local device. Now, imagine if someone, because, you know, it was a case of, you know, just get on with it. And they were like, oh, my PC's not working for whatever reason. I'm now going to use one of the kids' PCs. I can just quickly log on to a Zoom meeting. They've clicked record, and that data is now sitting on that child's PC, and you have you don't even know that it's there, let alone who has access to it. So knowing where your data is, backing it up securely, being in a position to deal with business continuity or disaster recovery is very important. So I've gone through a lot of slides, and when we send you the deck, just those pictures may not make sense. So I've just summarized it into a table for what's the pros and cons of Zooms and Teams. But if I had to summarize it, I would say this: Zoom is primarily a video conferencing tool. It's very, very good for ad hoc meetings, and it's very good for initial interactions. That ease of use really, really helps. And lots of organizations have adopted Zoom as their primary tool. However, Teams allows you to do an awful lot more. Yes, it's more complicated to use, but I see it primarily as an internal tool with very rich collaboration, which can then be extended out to key clients and key suppliers, and they then have access to that very, very rich environment. And that's to me is the main difference. But you can see now why we're saying it's not Zoom or Teams, it's Zoom and Teams. That concept of standardization, you can't look at multiple VC tools, even if your key clients use them. You've got to standardize on some. It's very, very important. And that theme of standardization runs throughout IT. When clients ask me, and a lot of clients say, you know, what's better? Should I use a PC or a Mac? Or, you know, should I have an iPhone or a Samsung? I think that's the wrong way of approaching the problem. From a corporate perspective, what you should be thinking about is, actually, it doesn't matter what the device I'm using is. Where is my data, and do I have control of it? And do I know who is able to access it, and is it secure? And that key concept of standardization, and it doesn't matter whether it's what laptops are we using, in the current case, what video cameras are we using, or even what headsets are we using, or firewalls, or routers, or even the internet connections that your staff are using at home. Try and get that concept of standardization in mind, because what it really does is it drives down the cost of supporting that equipment, and it drives up the productivity, because everyone starts sharing knowledge and they have that concept of, oh yeah, I know how to use this. And that's very important. So apply standardization to anything that you do on an IT basis. So I showed you that green line, and I think the question is, how do you get on that green line and how do you stay on that green line? I've already talked about standardization. Fully understand how in the last 3 months we've had to go just dive in and get on with it. It's focus on doing, but now it's time to step back and consider what's the future. So step back and take an overview. For me, IT strategy follows the business strategy. It's really important to work out, where is this organization going? What is it we're trying to achieve? And really, how does IT help that? Because IT can be a massive help in that process, or it can be a massive hindrance. So how do we get used to this process? I'm going to look at two aspects. I'm going to look at productivity and the whole risk profile and resilience. And these things help to get onto that green line and stay on that green line. So what does this picture conjure up in your mind? I'm sure you're looking at that and going, yeah, nice stock image, but we don't have that in our office. I certainly don't have that in my home. What is the point? So I suspect nobody has that type of filing system. However, I would like you to keep that picture in mind, because what I'm going to ask you is, what does your digital filing room look like? Let me give you some examples. I'm quite sure that you all use files and folders, and it'll be on local systems, so your laptop or your desktop. It might be on your iPad. It could be on your children's iPad. I'm sure there's data on company file servers. I'm sure there's data on company SharePoint sites, etc. Whether you've sanctioned it or not, I assure you that your colleagues are using some type of file sharing software. You know, it might be Dropbox or SugarSync or Google Drive, or, you know, hey, I want to send you a big attachment. The system won't allow it. I'll tell you what, I'll just use WeTransfer. Email, whilst it might be declining in use, is certainly not dead. I'm sure you all get far too much email, and in there are a whole load of attachments and data. You might be using Outlook, you might be using Google Mail. It doesn't matter, but there is an awful lot of information in your email. And I will also take an educated guess that there are USB keys and portable hard drives in your organization, which, hey, we're running this project, let's quickly put this onto this USB key and transfer it somewhere else. And no one goes to look, did we delete that data on that USB key? So whilst you might look at this picture and go, that doesn't apply to us, I suspect it applies more than you realize. So what impact does this digital filing system have on your productivity? I think, I first thought we lose hours and hours, and then I realized actually it's probably days and weeks, and in some cases it might even be months in terms of productivity. And that stands to reason. But I also think it has an impact on collaboration. You know, what tends to happen when you're working in a team, et cetera, and your digital filing systems and how you curate that data isn't done properly, what I think happens is that people take what I call the path of least resistance. So, hey, our system won't allow us to transfer a large file. I'll just use WeTransfer, whether we're allowed to use it or not. I'll just use a USB key. What happens to that USB key doesn't matter. I'll just use Dropbox. If you don't make life easy for your colleagues, they will take the path of least resistance. And they're not to blame for it, because they have a job to get done. And what they're thinking is, I just need to get this job. You IT guys are doing whatever you're doing. Doesn't matter. I'll just get around the system. But what ends up happening is that your data goes all over the place. And what we've done by introducing video conferencing, Zoom, Teams, whatever, is that we've added yet another dimension to this curating and managing of that data. But rest assured, if you don't get this right, it has a massive impact on productivity, which again translates to profitability, success, whatever way you want to think about it. The other area that it has a massive impact on is security. So the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, they now have real teeth. And if you're not paying attention to due diligence on what you should be doing, rest assured they will be contacting you and wanting to know what that happens, let alone your professional bodies. So what the ICO says is that you are responsible for the data and what happens to it. And irrespective of what you had to do in COVID-19, irrespective of how much you had to dive in, you are still responsible for that data. So you need to be thinking about, where is my data? Who has access to it? Is it accessible to the right people at the right time? If not, they will take the path of least resistance. Is it being backed up correctly? Do we have a process in place for business continuity and for disaster recovery? When was the last time we tested that plan? And generally speaking, are we following best practices, and are we actually legally compliant? The ICO is not saying you should not have any breaches. What they're saying is that's the reality of the modern IT environment. But when that happens, we're going to look at your systems and your procedures, and they better be more than tick box exercises. Are you managing your data correctly? So in that context, if you think about data, and it's like the DoD saying that anything above restricted and above, you won't use Zoom, you need to think about, how do we classify our data? Is it public? It doesn't matter, it's publicly available. So if you're a listed company, then all your accounts and your AGM, all of that is available. Or is it at the other end, it is actually restricted use? So let's say, I know some companies will be going through redundancy consultations and processes, or you might be in the process of a mergers and acquisition. Excuse the, I think that one's an ambulance, but we are right in the center of London, and we have a fire station at one side, we have Great Ormond Street on the other side, so it does tend to get busy, so my apologies for that. And if you increase the number of storage locations, and that's effectively what you've done by introducing increased use of video conferencing tools and collaboration tools, what you've done is that you've increased the cybersecurity burden, and you have increase the need to pay more attention to it. I'm quite sure when you've looked at the news, cybercrime has gone up in the period of lockdown significantly. So obviously a breach also has impacts on your reputation and what your clients view you as, etc. But it may not be a breach. Some of you will have had a subject access request, a digital subject access request. This is a legal process under GDPR regulations. It is incredibly burdensome. Certainly when our clients have had it, it has taken up more than 40 hours of time, and it has used up senior people in that process because it's a legally required process, and the directors, the partners, the principals are responsible for it. So you can see that in terms of risk and resilience, paying attention to this is really, really important. So what are the factors for success for staying on the green line? First thing is that the policy, and I'm not talking about IT details in terms of what kind of laptop am I using, but the policy must be set at high level. It cannot be delegated. Planning is an evolutionary process. It's not revolutionary. You should go for those incremental improvements, and I will go through that with you. Do not ignore staff training. There is no point in coming up with detailed policies, etc., and you say to people, here, read this policy, sign it to say that you read it and that you're adhering to it. The ICO will look at that and go, nice policy. What did you do to actually get it in place? So that regular repeated staff training, not only is it required for the risk piece, but imagine what that does for the productivity piece and making sure that people are following a similar system and those collaboration pieces work well. Make it easy for your staff, because if you don't, they will take that path of least resistance that I've been talking about. And I think very much it has to be a monitoring, encouraging process. And you explain to your staff why it's important, why they're doing it, and then what the processes are that they have to adhere to. But it stands to reason that if after you've done everything as a good employer and manager, If they're not doing it, you have to go down the discipline route. It is really, really important to review this on a monthly basis and keep going around that cycle, and I will show you that cycle. So I'm going through this fairly quickly. It's a very broad piece, and the IT strategy must follow the business strategy. And there is a huge amount of technology. And right now we're talking about a very small piece of the jigsaw, which is, you know, where does Zoom and Teams fit in? But you can see why it's part of a much, much bigger picture. It's our intention that we help you navigate this, and we are going to have more bite-sized briefings, as we've called them. But if there are topics that you would like to hear about, please either put them into the chat window or contact us, phone us, email us, it doesn't matter. And we're going to address more topics as time comes on in that two types, whether it's tactical or it's strategic. We do have a recommended process for IT projects. And whilst we apply this methodology to IT projects, if you think about it, it actually applies to any kind of change process. So here's the reality. We did dive straight in March. Pretty much every company had to do it. And if you look at that diagram, and I'm going to draw your attention to that doing bit, the red doing word highlighted with a yellow background, that's exactly what we had to do. And the instructions to our colleagues was, you know, just get on with it. We just need to make a decision and move forward, do the best you can, and we'll deal with any problems later on. Typically in an organization, that sits within a context of, you know, let's plan this and let's do this and let's review the plan. And that cycle usually works pretty well, the kind of planning, doing, reviewing, and going around that cycle. But actually, if you want to look at it from a strategic point of view, I would argue what we need to do is start at the top. And the starting point is, where are we right now? And now what I would suggest you need to do is just step back, look in the mirror. The world has definitely changed through COVID-19. And you ask yourself a question, which is, where exactly are we right now? You can't change it, whether it happened yesterday, 3 months ago, or 12 months ago. You can only change what happens in the future, but you need to take that hard look at yourself and answer the question of where are you now? And it is what it is. So don't run away from the reality, just deal with the reality. Often when people do that, they then go, okay, we now know where we are, we know what we need to do, and let's just get on with it. But I would argue that actually once you know where you are, the next step is to say, okay, we're here, but where do we want to be? And this has to be, and this is my piece about the senior people need to be involved, because this isn't just an IT question. This is a business question. And only the senior people will know, well, what does our marketing budget look like? You know, what's happening with our key clients? What's happening in our accounts and finance department? There's a whole layer of factors that only the senior people will be fully aware of, and they need to look at the IT strategy in that context. We actually have a methodology of doing this, and what we say is, look, it requires 2 hours per month from the senior person. They have to get into a consistent rhythm. Even in lockdown, we've continued our monthly meetings with our key clients, and we must have that engagement, because it's only the senior people who know the full picture. Once the senior person is determined, here's where we want to get to, that's when it goes to the cycle of, okay, from a technical perspective, let's go and plan this out. Let's do it. Some things will go well, some things won't go so well. Let's review it. And then we go back to the starting point. So you can see it's very much a cyclical process where we have a continuous improvement. And we do this in a evolutionary process, not a revolutionary process. So those of you who might be familiar with the term Kaizen, and this Kaizen principle of let's improve things all the time is very important. And that's one that we adhere to. Because the reality is this, when you look back, you keep doing this process in a monthly consistent fashion, and then you look back in 6 months' time, which was the time horizon that I had on my graph, you kind of go, actually, we've come quite a long way, haven't we? We're now doing things significantly differently to how we were doing them 6 months ago, 12 months ago. And you will realize we've made revolutionary changes, but in an evolutionary fashion. So let's go back to Teams and Zoom. How do you apply this? These are real pictures from one of our clients. And what we looked at is, okay, we know that the world is heading to a video conferencing world. They do use both Zoom and Teams. And it was a question of, what do we want to do with their meeting spaces? I'll talk about the ratio of meeting spaces to desk spaces later on. And I think that'll be one of the consequences of the COVID-19 fallout. But here there's a boardroom, there's meeting room 1, meeting room 2, and meeting room 3. And you can see here that actually meeting room 3, they designated as a quiet space with no IT equipment in there at all. But meeting room 1 and 2 have the same IT equipment, that standardization principle again, and it's geared towards ease of use. And let's train people properly and let's make this work. That's Gabor, one of our senior techs in the top left window. And he was just testing out that equipment because you want to test this stuff before you go into a real meeting. And it's worked very, very well. By the way, Teams also has the ability to do conference room. It's not just Zoom. So either platform will do this. Simon, I think you have a poll that you want to run.
Yeah, I do indeed. So I'm just going to launch it now. And the question that hopefully you've heard some sort of new insights and got some fresh perspective. And bearing that in mind, it'd be interesting to hear just where people think they are. So if you imagine that you're starting from now and going to the end of the year, what sort of trajectory would you say you're on? Do you think you're on the red line or the amber line or the green line? It'd just be interesting to know where people think they are at the moment. So I'll just give you a couple more seconds to vote, and then I'll share the results with you just for people to see where they think they might be. People are going through. I'll just give them a little bit more time. We are nearly there. I will assume that everybody who wants to vote has voted. And I'll just give you a couple more seconds. And I'll end the poll now, and I'll share the results with you just so you get a feel of where you think you might be, because obviously it's an environment where we're trying to put our best foot forward with people using video conferencing, and that impression that we create on clients, suppliers, partners, all of that kind of thing is quite important. Okay, so we did say that we were going to offer a call, but there are some people on the webinar who don't know us at all. And so before you entered into a call with us, you might want to know a little bit about who we are and what we do. So Raja, can I just ask you to give them a bit of background on that?
Okay, I can do that. Let's go back here. The Final Step is a small IT consultancy. I started this way back in July 1987. We're about to hit our 33rd anniversary. And I think our proudest achievement is that we still have clients from the first year of trading. I know we have a couple of clients on this call at the moment. We're very small, only about 20 people. We are based in central London, and I see it very much as a partnership with our clients, and we go into long-term engagements, which is to work out, well, how does the IT strategy help your business strategy? And sometimes IT is not the solution, and sometimes it is, but it's that process of stepping back, thinking it through, working out what needs to be done, translating that into an action plan, reviewing it and learning what we need to learn, and then going around that cycle over and over again. That's the key thing that we do. I see my job as helping clients make informed decisions, whether that's an IT solution or not. Obviously, given that we've been in business for such a long time, a lot of our clients have now become friends, and they have succeeded by adopting this methodology. I mentioned earlier on that COVID-19 is a game changer. I think here's the reality, and I think everybody intuitively knows this. The world has changed. We are not going back to 2019 in terms of all the infrastructure changes and things that have happened. And we've been affected on a personal level, on a professional level, even society. So all the things about, you know, what a school's going to do and university's going to do, it is going to have a major, major impact. The reality is that no one knows what the future is going to hold. There's lots of predictions and there's lots of stats. I'm sure all of you have seen the Chancellor's summer statement from yesterday, and people are very much wondering, is there a global recession on our hands? The Chancellor's statement yesterday, I think you can see it was geared to, let's try and keep unemployment under control and keep recession at bay. Even in our client sets, some clients are operating in sectors where they have been drastically affected. You know, one client has gone from 100% of income to 5% of income, and this is through no doing of their own. So this is just the impact of COVID-19. However, I think most companies can pat themselves in the back. I'm very pleased to see that we had more people saying that we're on the green line than nobody was on the red line. So that's great. And I think that COVID-19 can be a catalyst for the good. So there are a few things on here on this slide, and obviously it's going to have impact in lots of areas, but there's a couple here that I want to talk about. I've thought about this in terms of what I call myth busting. So I think prior to COVID-19, there was a view by a percentage of people that we need to be in the office 5 days a week. You know, we need that for the creativity, for the collaboration. And if everybody isn't in the office, then it'll have a dire impact on productivity. Well, the majority of people are reporting an increase in productivity over the last 3 months. Certainly when we have taken polls, both internally in our own organization and for clients, it's not going to come back to 5 days in the office for sure. And it's not going to be 0 days in the office for sure. Somewhere in the middle, there is a happy medium. And so that is going to have an impact on office space. And I think that's one area that's going to be very much affected. And I think the balance between how much meeting room space do you have and how much, you know, one person, one seat, one desk, I think that model is pretty much going to die away. And I think the open plan office, I think those days are numbered. So it's going to have a major impact on office space. From doing polling with people, I think the one size fits all makes just doesn't work. You know, if you're a young person and you're in rented accommodation, you don't have an environment where you can sit and work, or you have young kids at home, that whole, can I work at home? Can I do the homeschooling, etc.? That doesn't work either. So I think each individual person, you know, you need to set a policy and then have exceptions for each individual person. Another area that I think it's going to have a major impact on is recruitment. We've often approached this from, you know, hey, our potential pool of candidates is relatively limited, but COVID-19 has shown that that pool may be completely unlimited. Even just when preparing for this webinar, we had someone help us from Australia. And yes, we had to pick the meeting times carefully, but it worked really, really well. Whilst I think recruitment itself is going to become easier, I think the whole onboarding process, integrating them into the right teams and into their departments and holding on to really good people, that whole onboarding and retention piece is going to become more difficult. So really what I wanted to say was, you know, pause at this point in time, step back from your businesses, look at where your organizations are, work out what you need to do, work out what the opportunities are, and have a very deliberate action plan going forwards. Don't mumble along on that amber line. And the reality of the amber line is that you're just one step, one bit of bad luck event taking you onto the red line. So it's a very deliberate action of getting on that green line and work out how can technology, how can IT, and in this contest, we've just been talking about Zoom and Teams, but how can it help you? Because it can be a real hindrance or it can be a real help.
So hopefully you've heard some things that have given you a fresh perspective and a fresh understanding. And one of the points of the bite-sized briefings is that you can take things away, make better decisions, do things slightly differently. And so it'd be very interesting to hear from you and helpful for you to kind of fix up what it is that you think you need to do differently. If we could understand what is it that you found, the one insight that you found the most useful and what you might take away and make a change with. So if you wouldn't mind just putting into the chat what that is, what you think it might be, and the one thing that you would take away from this briefing, that would be very useful for us. So we'll give you a little bit of time, just a minute or so to do that. Also, if you have any questions, now is the time to put those in the chat as well. Any questions or clarifications, anything that we need to cover before we do make that offer, just in case anybody wants a call. So we will make that offer and you can opt into that if you want. Thank you very much for those answers that are coming in.
So I'll address a couple of those comments while you guys are typing. Thank you for the comments about the comparison between Zoom and Teams has been useful. That's very much appreciated. One question has come in which says, is there anything that slows our team's productivity? In terms of productivity, I think this has to be driven by the people at the top, and you adopt that cycle that I showed you, which is, let's work out where are we now. Let's work out what bits are using. I guess it doesn't matter whether it's Teams or Zoom. I guess whatever platform you've got, you want to drive return on investment. And, you know, I always use Excel as an example here. The majority of us use 30% of Excel. If you're a financial whiz kid or you do some very complex modeling, maybe you use 70%. In the Excel example, it typically only affects you, but in the team productivity example, work out, it doesn't matter which tool you're using, but work out which bits are working, which bits aren't working. How do we extend and embrace the use of these tools so that ultimately what we're driving is the productivity, which then translates to profitability and success. So how do we drive that? And you need a deliberate program to do it. You can't just say, hey, you know, go and look at some YouTube videos. It has to be far more deliberate and coordinated to do that. So thank you for that. Again, there's been an interesting comment here that one of the universities has, when we went into lockdown, they got 6,000 students onto Zoom and using Zoom to deliver those lectures remotely. And you can see that we've all had to adapt very, very quickly. And I think in the case of education, it's not going to go back to pre-COVID days anytime soon. It's a very, very different learning experience. I'm also aware of time. So if you have any other questions, please put them into the chat. If we don't get time to address them here, we will pick them up with you either later on in a phone call or in an email. I mentioned a little bit about what the final step, we abbreviated to TFS, what we are and what we do. But I think that headline of our role is to help you fulfill your potential through better use of technology. I think that kind of says it all. And the technology has to follow the business strategy, which is why we encourage you to go through that.
So I've just launched the poll because we are very close to the end of time. I think we've addressed all the questions that people wanted to, that they've put in the chat. But just in case anybody would like to take a separate call at a later time and just go into things in any greater depth, I've just put the poll up so that you have the option for that. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for voting and interacting with us. We hope that your use of IT serves you really well in the challenging times ahead. And we hope that we can be of further assistance with future bite-size briefings. So thank you very much for your time. I will end the poll now. Just give you a couple more seconds if there's anybody else who wanted to vote.
So I hope at the very least, this has raised some questions in your mind and you're able to go away and think about actually what impact does this have for my organization and how do we get on and stay on the green line. As I said earlier, if you would like to hear more topics, keep an eye out for this and please let us know. We'd be happy to cover anything that you would like. Thank you for your time and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.